Welcome to the Chapter 14 video lecture. Chapter 14 is entitled Edo Japan, a Closed Society. Now throughout this chapter we're addressing the worldview inquiry question. In what ways might a country's choice to remain isolated both reflect its worldview and result from its worldview? Now throughout this chapter you're not going to see it come up here, but I'll say it out loud. The actual elements of worldview that we are going to look at are geography, economy, and values. Now first we consider geography because of where Japan was located. It was a natural jump-off point for places like Korea, the Dutch, and the United States and the Americans to be able to use it as a trading port. Now, that would have had, obviously, an impact on the Japanese economy and the amounts of products that they are able to sell and actually get some of their products, like their rice, to world markets. And then it would actually challenge and change some of the values that the Japanese people and Japanese society had. And you'll see how there's even a breakdown in the Japanese feudal society. Now, first of all, as we do, we start every chapter with a story. Now here we need to understand who the main character discussed in this story is. Now first of all, I'll read it here for you so that you can get an idea of the actual story. It occurs in 1848. Ranald MacDonald, a 24-year-old Métis, insisted that he be set adrift in a small boat off the coast of Hokkaido, the northernmost island of Japan. Now the captain and crew of the Plymouth, the American whaling ship that Ranald MacDonald was leaving, tried to persuade the young man to stay with them. Why did he want to enter a country that was known to execute strangers? When the rudder from his small boat was later found floating in the sea, word was sent to North America that the young Métis was dead. Ranald MacDonald was the son of a Princess Raven at Chinook, and Archibald MacDonald, a Scottish official of the Hudson's Bay Company. He grew up in the Pacific Northwest, that's kind of near Seattle, in the early 1800s. As a child, he heard of 3 Japanese sailors who were shipwrecked and landed up in Fort Vancouver. Ranald MacDonald was fascinated by these men and the country that they had came from, a country that would not allow them to return. As Ranald MacDonald grew, so did his plan to visit Japan. He felt connected between his Chinook ancestry and the Japanese. He dreamed of becoming an interpreter and a teacher to gain fame and fortune when Japan would eventually open up to the world. Now the character discussed in this story is Ranald MacDonald, and the event occurred in 1848 when he asked to be set adrift near the Japanese island of Hokkaido so that he could realize his lifelong dream of teaching in Japan. Now first of all, Japan locked out the rest of the world, and Canada, and modern Canada, is very different, as we have one of the highest immigration rates per capita, which means per person in the world. Now how many immigrants came to Canada between July 2004 and 2005? Almost 250,000, 244,600. Now, how many of these immigrant people ended up coming to Alberta? Almost 18,000, with 17,400 people. What effect do you think a high immigration rate has had on your worldview? Now remember that here in Canada we have a collective worldview, as well as we have our individual experiences, which will create our individual worldviews. Now some of us may have inherited cultural traditions from a variety of cultural backgrounds. So, everyone's experience and individual worldview will be impacted differently. Now back to Japan. Early on, Japan had welcomed new visitors from their land, but this attitude had changed by the year 1848. And Japan was no longer welcoming people from other countries with their Western ideas. Now there continued to be threats from the West. By the late 1500s and the early 1600s, the Shogun considered foreigners to be a threat to his military control of Japan. Because if the daimyo were able to get a hold of European weapons, they would finally have the power to challenge his authority. And remember, the shogun and the shogunate, throughout the 15 different shoguns, wanted to create a stable, long-lasting government so that no one would challenge his authority. Now, there were new ways of belief and thinking that were being sent around, mainly from the Christian religion. Now, the shogun felt that loyalty to a Christian god and the church were threats to his authority. And in 1614, he ordered all of the Christian missionaries out of Japan. Their churches were destroyed, and those Japanese Christians who would not give up their faith could be executed. This persecution lasted until 1640, by which time it was estimated that thousands of Japanese Christians and about 70 missionaries were put to death. The Christian daimyos usually followed the shogun's orders, but many ronin and peasants were less compliant. Probably goes to show that they had less to lose. Now, they started to cut off contact with other groups of people, but Christian missionaries continued to come to Japan disguised as traders. The shogun seen traders as less of a threat because they were interested in trade and did not have a religious purpose. As a result, Shogun Tokugawa Iemitsu passed isolation or breaking laws. The penalty for breaking any of these laws was usually death. Now, there were 5 terms of the exclusion laws that you're going to need to understand. The first was that Christian missionaries and foreign traders were forced to leave. Newcomers were no longer allowed in the country. Number 2, the Japanese citizens were not allowed to travel within or leave the country. Number 3, ships that were big enough to make long voyages were no longer built, and those that already existed were destroyed. Those Japanese who were outside of the country and those were not allowed to come back home. This is an example of the shipwrecked Japanese people that Ronald McDonald met in Fort Vancouver, whom he became fascinated with and encouraged him or gave him that dream to go to Japan and teach. And finally, most foreign things were forbidden. All Christian books or scientific books with a scientific message were banned. All of those were examples of ways that the shogun and the shogunate restricted people from outside of their country to have an influence and contact with the Japanese culture. In addition to these exclusion laws, the shogunate restricted the movement of people within the country. So for example, people were required to have special documents to travel, curfews were put in place to stop people from moving around at night, and to even restrict them, wheeled transport was banned. And in 1639, the shogun banned Portuguese ships, expelled all foreigners except the Dutch, Korean, and Chinese traders. The shogun felt that this isolationist policy was essential to national security and was the only way to protect his power and Japanese culture. This is really important because it really shows those social controls that the shogun put into place and why he thought that it was so important. He thought it was essential to national security and the only way to protect his power and Japanese culture. However, there was exemptions to the exclusion laws. A small number of Dutch traders were allowed to remain in Japan. The shogun seen them as less threatening because they were only interested in trade and did not have a religious purpose. However, some people did take advantage of this loophole. However, there were 3 restrictions that were put on the traders that were allowed to come. 1, the families of the Dutch traders were not allowed to join them in Japan. The Japanese servants were forbidden to talk to the Dutch traders. And once a year, the traders had to pay their respects to the shogun and stay for 3 months in Edo. In addition to that, the shogun had 2 other strategies that he used to monitor the Dutch traders. Number 1, he had Dutch scholars learn and study Dutch medicine, and 2 sons of samurai were sent to learn the Dutch language. In 1720, European books were once again allowed in Japan with the exception of books about Christianity. The shogun encouraged the study of astronomy. Most Japanese people, however, were not exposed to the ideas because the shogun thought that it might confuse them and they might forget about their absolute obedience to him. However, they still went about maintaining rule in Japan. And Japan was able to continue with its feudal system because the economy was very much tied to agriculture and social classes were the same as they had always been. The shogun wanted to prove that Japan and its rule of it were still strong. However, because of a lot of the controls that were put on the people outside of the country and a lot of the controls that were put on people inside of the country, also known as internal and external forces, people started to pressure the government. And we start to look at in what ways did isolation lead to political, economic, and social changes in Japanese society. So we look at the external forces that were put on the Japanese government by places like the United States, and the discontent, or how people within the country started to become fed up with a lot of the controls that the shogunate was putting on their lives. Ronald McDonald found that Japan was a very stable country, but had very little change over 200 years. Now, what were three things that the Japanese felt were very important to their society? The first was peace, safety, and security. The second was harmony, respect, and the sense that everyone had their place. This was a direct belief of the Confucianist religion. And the third was that leisure time and opportunities for personal expression and enjoyment of the arts, sports, and entertainment and craft was important. However, there were rigid rules that were put in control to control the lives of citizens in society. The first was that they could not move from social class of their birth. So therefore, social class was hereditary. Number two, they were not encouraged to think for themselves, because if they were more likely to challenge the shogun and his authority, and there was very little personal freedom of expression. Remember, if anyone criticized the government or were too open about their thoughts and ideas, the shogun would see them as a threat. Now, the shogun still had a lot of influence. So why did the Japanese society experience very little problem with crime, bandits, robbers, pirates? The same thing in which other societies had? And to be honest, this is still true today. The shogun had very good social control of the society and the Japanese people. They knew that if they disobeyed the rules and the laws, there would be harsh punishments and even death. However, there was a booming economy as a result of a lot of the restrictions that the shogun put on people. These long periods of stability and peace gave Edo Japan a booming and expanding economy. There were some positive and negative results. The positive results were number one, farmers increased their production to 2 crops a year. Improvements in roads increased the amount of trade within the country. The population increased within the cities, and silver and gold were introduced as money because using rice as a form of currency was becoming very inefficient. Now, there were some negative effects. One, there was very little foreign trade, which did not allow people to get their access goods to foreign markets. Number two, the peasants or lower class were being heavily taxed. And number three, the use of rice as payments and transactions held back the economy because it was very inefficient. However, because of the prosperity of the Japanese culture, there was a golden age of culture where art and culture flourished. Many of the cultural aspects that we know of today were developed during this time period. You have kabuki theater, which I'll define some of these at the very end, and here are some other examples of cultural aspect in arts that developed during this period. Haiku poetry, which you've written examples of. Tea ceremonies, and you see an example of a traditional tea ceremony room in the Japanese gardens. Kabuki theater, baku, which I'll define later. Mass painting, kendo, and kabuki theater. As I said, I will define later. There were these places called the floating worlds. The floating worlds were places where cultural activities occurred and where there were fewer rules and controls. Men could relax, unwind, and enjoy themselves. However, the authorities kept these entertainment districts under surveillance. Why is it important to allow for a place for people to relax and enjoy? Well, people know that they need to be able to have a place where there were less rules, where they could actually blow off steam. Now, there started to become some cracks in the foundation of the Japanese society, and we need to understand how did this isolation or isolationist policies contribute to the end of Japan's closed feudal society. Well, Ronald McDonald's first contact was with the Ainu people, who greeted him warmly. His ability to speak English was useful to the Japanese, who used him to teach the Japanese to communicate with visitors from America and Britain. Now, no matter how hard the shogun tried to stop anything from changing, even though there wasn't really anything that he could do to really change this and stop the clock from changes. Because there was some major class systems in upheaval, meaning that people were starting to fight back against a lot of the restrictions that were put on them. And at the end of the Edo period, the merchants had so much power and wealth that it was very difficult to be able to stop them from being able to fight back. A couple of the reasons that how they were able to develop so much wealth was that they were charging to change rice and convert it into cash. And they were starting to loan people money. And we need to also understand what other changes were happening that eroded other class structures in Japanese society. The peasants needed money to pay the high taxes that they owed. Alternate attendance in the constructions of roads almost bankrupted the daimyos. There wasn't very much real work for the samurai to do, which resulted in some of the samurai marrying into the merchant classes. Therefore, you start to see some people intermarrying between different classes. Who did people end up blaming for a lot of the problems in society? Well, they were starting to blame the shogun and high officials because they felt that he had taken power illegally that had actually belonged to the emperor. There were starting to be a lot of disasters and hard times. By the late 1800s and the late 1500s, Japan had many natural disasters that had brought about famine and took the lives of more than almost a third of the population. What other things resulted as a result of these disasters? Land was deserted and many peasants fled into cities. The price of rice rose steeply because there was no one working the fields. And city dwellers rioted because the prices increased and they attacked the wealthy. People were very unhappy with the shogun's response because he felt that he didn't do enough to make effective changes to protect everyone in society. Now, all of those were examples of internal forces that were put on the shogun. Now you start to see some expansionist threat from the West and those external forces that were put on the shogun to open up contact with the West, Russia, and England. Now the major countries that were requesting trade with the Japanese by the 1800s were Russia, England, and the United States. The shogun responded to the requests of the foreigners by saying that the ships should be fired on and driven away. Even if they landed on, the people should be imprisoned and their ships should be destroyed. Now, as we start to transition into chapter 15, we start to see how you transition from the isolationist policies underneath the shogunate in the Edo period and the transition into the Meiji Restoration or the Enlightened period, where Japan started to allow for some contact with the West. Now finally, here is some vocabulary that you need to understand throughout the chapter. Per capita means average per person. A martyr is a person willing to die for their convictions or their beliefs. You need to understand the isolation and exclusion laws, where those laws that were passed by the shogun to cut off the contact from the rest of the world. Kabuki is a form of Japanese theater. Sumo wrestling is a sport based on an ancient Japanese performance. Haiku poetry are 17 syllable poems that contain simple imagery and usually refer to some sort of aspect of nature. Bakaraku is a puppet theater which large puppets enact ordeals of separated lovers or dueling samurai. and No is a Japanese musical, dance, or drama. I hope that you enjoyed our Chapter 14 lecture,